Thank you.
So welcome to Villa Firenze, buon pomeriggio. I'm impressed that you all came back from outdoor because the secret of longevity is clearly somewhere else, is in nature. And, but I must say that the first time we conceived these events with Professor Ricordi and the director of ARPA, we were here on a night, which was a cold night, and we were discussing these ideas. We wouldn't expect to have such a nice setting, but it means that we were on the right track. So welcome, it's a great pleasure. Today's event has got a title which is, I would say, intriguing, exploring the longevity code, because it's a fact that today people are living longer than ever. And yet it's also something that we all know, these additional years are not always accompanied by good health, active life, and social gratification. And therefore, I think our common aim tonight is very simple, but momentous. We need to work together to turn the blessed gift of a longer life in a truly nourishing existential and spiritual experience. Across the world, healthcare systems are confronting a profound challenge. Longevity is increasingly associated with the growing prevalence of chronic diseases, placing pressure on healthcare systems and on quality of life. And of course, for decades, modern medicine has achieved extraordinary success in treating diseases. Yet it has largely operated within a reactive model, intervening when illness has already manifested. Today, advances in biomedical science are opening the door to a new paradigm. Increasingly, researchers and policymakers are converging around a simple but transformative idea. The true measure of progress in healthcare is not only how long we live, but how many of those years are lived in good health. And this concept, often referred to as health span, is reshaping the way we think about medicine, public health, and innovation. Scientific progress in areas such as genomics, regenerative medicine, advanced diagnostics, and artificial intelligence is enabling a shift toward a more predictive, preventive, and personalized model of care. And the goal there is not only to treat disease, but to anticipate it, slow its progression, and strengthen resilience throughout the life course. And of course, this transformation is not only a scientific opportunity, but also an ethical, social, and economic necessity that we need to push through proactive international cooperation. And in Italy, this vision is reflected both at national and at the regional level. At the national level, we have at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs a dedicated working group on the internalization of the biotechnological sector. At the regional level, Lombardy stands out as one of Europe's leading healthcare and life sciences ecosystems, with a strong concentration of research hospitals, universities, and biotech companies, and a growing focus on innovation and longevity in longevity and health span. And we think that in the context of transatlantic relationship and friendship, this is an area where we have lots of potentials, opportunities to explore. And I would add that the last export data shows that the highest growing sector in Italian exports to US is actually pharmaceuticals. But we didn't know that before, right? So this is just come. So I would say the challenge of longevity is not only scientific, it's also about how societies organize research, innovation, and public policy to turn knowledge into real progress for people. The discussion that follows today will address precisely these questions: how science, technology, and policy can converge to shape the future of health and aging. Before I begin, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all those who made this event possible, all my team, all the distinguished speakers and the moderators who we will meet very soon. It has been a collective effort, and it grew out of a trip to Florida, where I met Professor Ricordi, whom of course I knew by a long time for other reasons, died to a musical family tradition that everybody is aware of in Italy. It is now a great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker. I would start with Dr. Alicia Jackson, Director of ARPA-H, whose leadership in advancing transformative biomedical innovation highlights the importance of translating scientific breakthroughs into real innovation. Professor Camillo Ricordi, coordinator of the Lombardy Healthspan Network, whose pioneering work in diabetes research, cell transplantation, and regenerative medicine has had a global impact on the understanding of prevention and healthspan. Federico Rampini, columnist at Corriere della Sera and writer whose insights into global trends and societal transformation help us place scientific progress within a broader geopolitical and cultural context. And then Esther Krofa, Executive Vice President for Health at the Milken Institute, who will serve as the moderator of today's discussion and will guide us through this important conversation. So thank you all for being here. I know that the recipe for longevity sometimes is not sitting, but be a bit patient and then we'll stand up again. We'll have a nice drink and we'll end up the evening pleasantly. Thanks again for coming, and the discussion will commence very soon.
Ambassador did an amazing job of talking about the data and really setting the stage for this conversation, because as we think about the world and the world's population, it is aging. It's aging certainly in high-income countries, but we also see that it's aging in low-income to middle-income countries as well. The learnings that we're going to have with those who have experienced this trajectory of aging and aging well, we can apply to the rest of the world's population. When we think about the United States, $4.9 trillion that we spend on healthcare alone, that is greater than the GDP of Japan. Our healthcare outcomes on average are about equated to Vietnam, and yet we spend magnitudes of order more per patient than in any of those other countries. We're getting less for more. And as we think about the rest of the world's population, it's not just about, are we increasing our lifespan? When we think about women in particular, they spend 25% more of their life in poor health. So we need to think about this from a variety of different perspectives that we're going to hear today. How do we get ahead of disease? Before you're sick, how do you understand at a cellular level when that cell turns into one that's potentially going to turn into a disease and manifest into symptoms? How do we intervene earlier? I would argue our healthcare systems are completely unprepared for that paradigm. What you're asking physicians to do is to look across all of your data, your genetic data, environmental data, family data, your own lifestyle and behavioral data, all of us that are wearing those Oura rings and the Apple Watches, and asking physicians, predict for me what my health outcome is going to be, and how do I get ahead of that? And so we'll talk about that on the panel. We'll also talk about how do we think about from a perspective of purpose and life and living well, what does all of that look like? So I am excited about this conversation. I am going to start with you, Alicia, because as you were introduced, you're leading this new agency, and the idea of ARPA-H, high risk, high reward. You think about how do we transform the future of human health with really big bets. You did that at DARPA, and now you're going to do that here at ARPA. So as you think about this issue of the longevity code, what is it about the ARPA model that could be applied to thinking about longevity?
Thank you so much, Esther. And thank you, Ambassador, for hosting us in this beautiful location. It's lovely to talk about longevity here because I want to live forever here. So for those who aren't familiar with the ARPA model, it is unlike anything else in the world, I would say, and unlike anything else even within the U.S. federal government. The first ARPA, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, was formed right after the launch of Sputnik. And you have to take yourself back to that time and understand the U.S. had multiple programs in getting into space, mostly for defense and military purposes. Air Force was running a project there, the Navy was running a project, and suddenly the Soviets launch Sputnik. And President Eisenhower at the time, how can this be, right? We've been funding all this research. Suddenly we look like we are not a global power. How could we have been outmatched here? And then what they realized is that unfortunately, the traditional funding systems that we have tend to move slowly. They can be quite parochial, and they're not organized to be able to move quickly, take new information in. Often they exist to almost sometimes fund themselves, to support their kind of entrenched interests. And so he decided, and this could have never been formed any other way, to very rapidly stand up a completely different org, where many of the constraints that typical government agencies have were taken away. So it's very easy to hire top talent. And those folks are called program managers, and they're really the kings and queens of an ARPA. They only come for 3 years, so they're term limited. And they come from academia or industry. And why they come is because they have an incredible idea about what the future could look like. And it should be a nearly unbelievable idea. If everyone in a room hears a program idea and says, yes, of course, I think we can do that. It's not risky enough. It's not bold enough. And their whole job is to figure out how to make that unbelievable idea believable by understanding every single scientific advance or technological advance that needs to happen. And then what occurs is we put that out to the research community, academics, startups, industry, other nonprofit research organizations, and say, tell us the best ideas you have to how to make this happen, how to achieve this goal. This is very unique. It's unique because we can fund everything from basic research all the way to incredibly applied. So we can fund massive companies and tiny ones as well. And we give them a very short timeline. You have to figure out this breakthrough in 5 years or less, typically. But we also give them an incredible amount of capital to do so. So, for example, a couple of our programs in the longevity space, such as Prosper, is a $144 million program. So we can fund $200 million on something, and that is so precious because it means that we can focus the research community on this problem. They don't have to write other grants, they don't have to do anything else. We just ask them to work on that problem. And so it is an incredibly unique model, and it has given us the internet, GPS, stealth technology, mRNA vaccines, and other therapeutics. It's quite incredible what you can do when you move at speed. You're able to take risk, and you can work across the research community. And so 3 years ago, almost 4 at this point, it was decided to form a new ARPA for health. And our whole job is to drive breakthroughs in human health. And I can't tell you how much I love being at DARPA, but I love even more being at ARPA-H, because we really are able to touch every human being on Earth if we are successful. And longevity was a key reason that I came to ARPA-H. It was a key reason I wanted to come here, and that's partially because of my own history building a women's health company focused on menopause and longevity. For those of you who may not be familiar, when a woman goes through menopause, her rate of aging speeds up 5 to 7%. And post-menopause, she continues to age rapidly. So cardiovascular disease will become her number one risk, and it kills 10 times more women than breast cancer. Women become much more likely to develop Alzheimer's. They account for 2 out of every 3 Alzheimer's patients. She's more likely to fall and break her hip. She's more likely to suffer from numerous other conditions. And so this is one of the reasons women spend so long in ill health. And so I became very deeply interested in this problem because it was very clear that menopause was a clear trigger in a woman's body for aging. And if we could focus on that and understand how we could delay it or mitigate the impacts of going through menopause, we could essentially help women with longevity, with living longer and healthier. Because it turns out that women who go through menopause later live longer. It's a very interesting fact that most women are never told, nor most people, nor most physicians. And so when we look at this problem, and we look at how much these chronic diseases of aging are really costing our nation, trillions of dollars, that if we can go upstream and prevent those kind of triggers that really trigger accelerated aging, or even be able to reverse biological age, the impact is enormous because you don't see those chronic diseases necessarily manifest, or they manifest much later in life. And so we really can give people decades or more of healthy years. And that is incredibly powerful, not just for individuals and their families, but for the nation overall from a cost savings perspective.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'm going to turn over to you, Dr. Ricordi, because that was a wonderful transition for us to understand the biological factors of aging. As you wrote that book, The Health Span Code, which I did have a chance to read and to go through, you talk about so many different things that happen all the way through an individual cells, mutations, and changes that are impacted by all of those epigenetics that I talked about. To help us understand, how do we reverse aging? What do we understand at a scientific level that we can now intervene much more quickly than we could before?
Yes, and if I may, a lot of people ask me why you're directing a center to cure diabetes for 30 years and now you're working on health span or aging. And this is a very important thing to understand. Like diabetes, a child diagnosed at 10 years of age of diabetes type 1 loses an average 13 years in the United States of lifespan. The average in the world is 24 years. And if you are unlucky and you live in a low-income country, you lose 47 years of lifespan compared to a child same age, 10 years, that doesn't have diabetes. And diabetes is the tip of the iceberg. That is all other chronic diseases. There is this gradient, depending how much you can afford the top technology, top cures. And in the United States, you were saying, like, when I updated the slide, is now 5.6 trillion a year of healthcare, 20% of the GDP in an age range after age 60, where 90% of the people are affected at least by one chronic disease condition, 75% by two that are also the comorbidity that then if you get COVID make problem bigger, and is a population that will double in the next 2 decades. So we cannot possibly think to arrive to spend 40% of the GDP in healthcare. But we live in this kind of proactive medicine system where you start becoming a subject of interest when you get sick, see a doctor, go to a hospital, and then we are very good keeping people alive longer, but with incredible cost to suffering and society. So that's the link with diabetes that I think is so important. And the whole name of the challenge now is predictive. We have an ecosystem, what we call the ecosystem of the pillars of health span, but start with predictive diagnostic. That is the huge opportunity that we have to identify risk factor at the molecular level that can precede the development of a disease by 3 or 5 years or even more. And if you identify this invisible risk factor, you can intercept, neutralize them, and try to prolong lifespan in physical, cognitive, and mental health. So it's becoming a challenge, and that's what we're launching in this program in Milan with Region Lombardy, is because I cannot afford to do it in Miami. By the way, I'm coordinator of the Lombardy Health Span Network because someone in Italy said you are coordinating this effort, but I'm full-time faculty at the University of Miami where I direct the Cell Transplant Center and diabetes efforts. But the challenge is that in Milan I can do a trial with 1,000 people with $200,000, and I just have to raise 100,000 matching fund. Already have the other half to test these predictive markers through a dry blood spot new test with an amazing guy that was able to identify the spike protein and distinguish if it comes from COVID or from the vaccine, from the virus or from the vaccine, based on 2 amino acid difference. And is now validated in the United States, in Europe, opening a laboratory, the first laboratory in San Diego for the United States. And I asked him, can you help me if I give you a list of 50 molecular markers that are predictor of something moving in the wrong direction with our health span? Can you help me? How many of these can you identify? And he came out with 49. So he said, fantastic. Can you do it with a single drop of blood or two? And he says, yes, we can do it. And then I say, can you now make it affordable? It costs less than $50. Otherwise, I cannot fit it with the budget. And he said, yeah, if you do 1,000, we can work with this number. So this is an important concept because it introduces also the element that we were used to think healthcare and research and companies. I was at a CEO meeting in Miami recently. We used to say you need to show safety and efficacy. But today there is the third leg of the stool that is even more important, is safety, efficacy, affordability. Because if you develop cures that nobody can afford, it's like the example of what used to be the GLP-1 receptor agonist. Like if you have to spend $1,100 a month and 1/3 of the Americans have insulin resistance and are overweight, it becomes economically unsustainable. So, but I think that the first challenge is, I mean, there are several pillars. It's an ecosystem. It's not that you take a supplement, omega-3 or vitamin D or anything, and you resolve. If you then go and eat hamburger, French fries, and other stuff that go in the opposite direction. So it is an ecosystem, but it starts, I think we can do so much on predictive diagnostic just to not even go to the hospital, receive a postcard, give a blood drop, receive results back, and see if there are risk factors that we can intercept and neutralize.
So help us understand the difference between what you're talking about with predictive diagnostics. You go into your physician's office, you get a blood test, you can identify potential for, just say 39 or 49 different molecular markers, versus lifestyle interventions, diet, nutrition, and exercise. How do we prioritize the difference between the two, and what are the implications for each on aging?
Yeah, you actually don't prioritize, because there's a second pillar and the third pillar is exactly nutrition and then exercise. But nutrition is not like the pyramid, whether you see it like this or like this, but it's like the category of food that we consume. You have to go one step further. What is the inflammation index of that product? What are the contaminants? What are the animals that you consume eating themselves? And like the level of omega-3 inflammation that you can have.
I think we can do that.
Here.
Yeah.
It's so important, healthy nutrition, but and it is an ecosystem because there are trials that fail to show some endpoints, like the VITAL study for cardiovascular, because maybe you choose the wrong endpoint and you're not part of an ecosystem. This was a study where you say Japanese people in Okinawa, they eat 1 serving of fish a day, and they have 1/4 of the cardiovascular disease of Americans. So let's do this big Harvard study and give the dose of 1 serving of fish that was 0.83 grams of omega-3 that I consider a placebo dose because it doesn't change our inflammation index, and see if, and then come out, omega-3 don't decrease the risk of cardiovascular, because the little difference is the Japanese people eat that fish. It's their meal, maybe with a little rice. And, but in America, you give a pill equivalent, then you go eat hamburger, French fries, and pizza like there is no tomorrow. So the balance of the arachidonic acid that is, and you think who care about omega-3 or omega-6, but just changing this ratio, it can affect your regulatory T cells, your immune response, increase the so-called Th17 cells that are the aggressive one. It can affect all autoimmune diseases that affect 20% of the population with 100 different pathologies. And they have a counter, so you need to balance. You need both omega-6 and omega-3, but if you're very high inflammation or silent inflammation, is a problem. If you have vitamin D deficiency, for example, we found out that in autoimmunity, you can prevent 39%, almost 40% of autoimmune disease if you have the correct amount of vitamin D. In diabetes, we just published a study that there is a direct correlation. You tell me what is the child vitamin D, at diagnosing, I tell you how aggressive and severe is autoimmunity at onset and how fast they lose the insulin production. And it's so cheap. It's like $19 for 2 years supply, and no one in pharmaceutical wants to invest. When I ask a president of a pharmaceutical company, can you give us a few million to do a randomized trial to demonstrate this? He says, excuse me, what did you say, $19 every 2 years? next idea. So it's, you get in this kind of problem.
So it's not a choice. We need to do both and, right? We need to have healthcare systems where we can do the predictive diagnostics, We need to have the underlying data. You just talked a little bit about that. How do we understand the differences between, omega-3 and omega-6, and how do we drive lifestyle changes? But all of them need to happen at the same time in a way that is affordable for the healthcare system to consume. Right.
Yeah, if you think the simplest way, if you don't have access to hundreds of multi-omic data, I can tell you a prediction of your health span. Just look at insulin resistance and inflammation in your blood, and that is a very simple test. But now with these 50 molecular markers, we'll look at oxidative stress, at inflammation from protein, from fat, from lipid metabolism, mitochondrial health, AMPK activation, and all kind of variables. But at the end, even if you look the famous 12 hallmark of aging and what can affect them, you throw in insulin resistance in the middle of that table, and everything goes off the clock. So some things are very simple to correct.
Mr. Rampini, you are a journalist, you are an author, you travel the world, you've lived in China, and you've done a lot of work in Japan, of course. You just wrote this book around what we can learn from the Japanese story. They've had many decades ahead of other high-income countries in terms of managing an aging population. With the book that you recently wrote, what can we learn from the Japanese model that we can apply to other high-income countries?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to Ambassador Marco Peronaci, who, in order for you to better introduce my book, organized a Japanese cherry blossom in the garden. That's fantastic. That's his ability. I'm impressed.
It's a miracle.
I suppose another reason why he was so gentle as to include me in this very authoritative panel is that the color of my hair makes me a natural in a panel on longevity. So yes, so I wrote this, I published, my last book was on Japan, and the title is The Lesson of Japan. So what can we learn? And a big part of it is about longevity. So yes, you're right, Japan has been a pioneer in terms just of the numbers. They were the first advanced society to experience all the demographic evolutions that now we are familiar with. So an increase in longevity, and then also an aging society overall, and also a drop in birth. And the decline in population of overall, their population is declining. So they are the number one in the world, but Italy is very next. Italy is coming next. We are in Europe one of the countries with the highest longevity average. And one other thing, because Professor Ricordi mentioned the island of Okinawa, we have our own Okinawa, which is Sardinia. So there are two islands that compete for the secret of longevity. One is Okinawa and the other is Sardinia. So there's a number of research, very, very interesting, on the reason why on these two places in the world people live longer and better, longer and in a better health. So there's all the topics that you have mentioned, nutrition, food habits, lifestyle in a more general sense, including a sense of purpose in life, which is very interesting. This is the research on why the inhabitants of Okinawa live longer and a better life goes deeply into cultural topics. But I will just mention this. What I want to say is that when I compare Japan and Italy on this topic, I am struck, because I am a journalist and a writer, by the difference in the narrative. That in Italy, although we are almost champions in longevity, almost every discourse on longevity is somehow conveys a sense of doom. Yeah. It's almost alarmist or apocalyptic. It's okay, longevity is a good thing, it's good to live longer, but, and all the emphasis is on but. And then starts the long list of issues, problems, and an aging society is something terrible to manage, and there are so many problems we have to solve, etc., etc. In Japan, there's a kind of serendipity surrounding the topic of longevity. They seem to be rather happy and relaxed about longevity. And that's very interesting. The approach is different. I think because we are almost on a par with the Japanese in terms of results and numbers, maybe we should learn about their narrative. For instance, they have, in the current political and economic debate in Japan, they have rediscovered a topic that was pioneered by American economists more than 30 years ago, the longevity dividend. Longevity as an addition, not only to our lifespan, but to our wealth and opportunities. Longevity as an opportunity. For instance, just to mention one of the many aspects of this debate, they will say, you know, that they have this problem of a decreasing population and therefore shortages in their workforce. How do they address this? One of the, of course, Western experts will go to Japan and say, you have to open to immigration. That's the only solution. And the Japanese will answer, at least some of them, we already do. We have immigrants, only they're Japanese. And they are re-entering the workforce from retirement. So people who have reached the official ending of their work career, in fact, can be so useful to our society at large and to even the business world that we welcome them back home into the workforce in several and many flexible ways where elderly people can be very, very, very useful.
What drives that? What drives that narrative? Is it coming from just the way the culture thinks about aging? It's not stigmatized as we have in other parts of the world. They value individuals as you age. Where does that come from? Where is that drive that we're going to retrain, reskill our workforce? We're not going to think about the aging population as a burden, as something we need to create special infrastructure around. Where does that come from?
So you're perfectly right in pointing that there is a cultural explanation. No doubt Confucianism plays a big role here because it is an ancient philosophy that has always given a lot of importance, authority, and role to older people. Confucianism is very much about respect of older people and how they are a deposit of knowledge, of wisdom. So that's certainly a big part of the story. It's not the only one. I think that, you know, just living in Japan and, for instance, being a beneficiary of a society with literally zero crime makes you understand better that, you know, if every society was so, had that percentage of older people, probably crime rates would be lower in the rest of the world too. And then, but I think that they are ahead of us in terms of exploring all the opportunities that an aging society and longevity can offer. And I am a member of an Italian think tank, the European House Ambrosetti, where we study all what is now dubbed with a neologism, the silver economy, the economy that is linked to this color of hair. And the three words that are important are health, so how longevity can make us invest more and better in the health sector in order to live not only longer but with a better health. So health. Wealth, because we live in society where wealth is more concentrated among older people. They are wealthier, so they are a market. They're not a burden. In fact, they are. This is true for. There was a fantastic piece by Greg Ip, the chief economist at the Wall Street Journal, about how the role of over 60s in the American economy. That's where money is. So for wealth management, it's a big, big market and growing and growing. And then the third, so health, wealth, and self. All the technological innovation that can make life easier for people who have, on average, more health issues than the younger. But that is a reverse approach to longevity as a driver, an engine of growth, innovation, jobs creation.
It's been amazing to see over the last 20 to 30 years, maybe even the last 10 years, how the narrative of aging has shifted. We've talked about individuals that have chronic disease conditions. We talk about high utilization in the ER as something that we need to solve. We had the triple aim that talked about how we need to address our issues as a healthcare system. And now we're talking about longevity, which is not this idea about let's just work on your aging process, but rather on how well you live as you age. So Alicia, just coming back to you, as you think about the investments at ARPA-H in health, where are you the most excited? Are you seeing the same trend about longevity as an opportunity? It's an investment, it's not a cost. When you're funding Prosper and you're funding these academic labs, are you excited about the science that you're seeing? Where do you think about this issue of, it's not just that we need to monitor us as we age. We need to change this narrative that we can age well, we just need the science to align with us along that entire spectrum.
Yes, that's very much our viewpoint. Although a challenge with the American system, and I think in many other places, is that all the regulatory bodies have still and continue to focus on disease. So when we think about therapeutics for aging, therapeutics for reversing aging, therapeutics for longevity, the regulatory system is not really set up for that. They would like you to run a clinical trial. Running a clinical trial in longevity would take you 50 years. Your patents would have already expired by that time. So that is a major challenge. So how we think about it is one, just directly attacking that issue. So Andrew Brack, who's one of the program managers here today, is running a program called Prosper. And what it's doing is very similar to what the professor said, which is how do we think about causal biomarkers of aging so that we can run a clinical trial in just 3 years and looking at how it affects those causal markers rather than 50 years. And that way we can potentially go through the FDA because there's many therapeutics, you hear about them all the time, rapamycin, GLP-1s, antivirals, SGLT2 inhibitors, which I'm sure you're deeply familiar with. But it's very hard to run a clinical trial on those unless we have those causal biomarkers. So it's so critically important. We couldn't do more work there.
Yeah. And you met with the FDA, Professor Ricordi. Yeah, today. What did the FDA say with regard to what Alicia just talked about?
Well, what I can
Breaking
say,
news, yeah.
Breaking news is that we just did an appeal to the Secretary RFK Jr. to reclassify islet transplant like organs under OPT and UNOS because we are the only country regulating them like drugs. and who produce them like a pharmaceutical company. So I developed the field 40 years ago. I invented the method to extract the islets from the human pancreas, and we train. I give up the patent for free to the world. We train everyone and their sister from Europe, Canada, Australia, China. And now I receive a message like France says, thank you from France. Everyone with an advance in this field owe you something. Now it's approved and reimbursed as standard of care in France, $47,000 per transplant, and we did 300 transplants. China called me. Thank you from China. We did 310 transplants. Canada doesn't even have waiting list, and in the United States we are 5 transplants with an IND, FDA, and the cost of doing this trial, if you're not Vertex, that can invest $2 billion in a project, and you are an academic institution or a small foundation or a small biotech, is a challenge. But that is a completely different problem. In health span and how it links to all what we're discussing, I think that the fascinating story is that when I go to Italy and I say, look, United States is ranked 69 worldwide in health span, and Italy ranks 10, and Japan and Singapore and South Korea is in the top 3. But they say, so we have Mediterranean diet, we have Sardinia, so we should be taken as an example from United States. And I say, not so fast, because your children have the highest obesity in Europe. So 10 years, 15 years from now, do you want to be towards the 69 ranking or towards the Japan ranking in the top 3? So that these are red flags that impose us the time to act is now. And like for the regulatory system that I am imploring this modernization, like make us competitive again in the development of new cures. But also there are so opportunities, and we don't have to be discouraged if United States is number 61, because Singapore was in the same position 20 years ago and now is in the top 3. And what is called is health span engineering. I mean, it's a circular, you have to address an ecosystem that goes from the predictive diagnostic, early intervention, curing those already affected with advanced therapy, and then very important, prevent disease recurrence after an initially successful cure. If you want to have an impact on epidemic or this tsunami of disease, we cannot think just to wait for the most severe cases of diabetes or COVID and then do an advanced cell therapy, because in the meantime, diabetes grow from 170 million in 2000 to 590 million today, projected becoming 850 million in 2 decades, and then what do? I can do 1,000 transplants, 10,000 transplants a year, 100,000 transplants doesn't make, it's like a pimple.
So are the regulators, are they ready? Are they aligned with this idea that we cannot run a clinical trial that takes 50 years? It's beyond our lifetime. How do we accelerate clinical trial design so that we can enroll within 12 months or 18 months if we can use technologies that you just described with these blood-based tests? Do they understand this paradigm shift?
I think everyone, well, Andrew Braca understands it better than anyone because the Prosper is centered on this, and is the same thing in my micro budget of 100,000 I'm trying to do in Italy because these markers, it was a question of surrogate marker. We cannot wait 30 years for an endpoint in aging, but if you see, I want to see in 6 months to 1 year if we are going in the right direction. And if you're affecting insulin resistance, inflammation, and some of these markers that you can neutralize, you know you're going in the right direction. So I think the name of the game is to show a difference early and without waiting for 20 or 30 years.
What are you the most excited about scientifically? What would you like to uncover in the next 6 months?
Well, this is linked to cellular therapy and mitochondrial transfer and exosome extracellular vesicles that we're working, because one of the reasons I've been very interested in the reversal of biological age beyond the studies of gene therapy and bringing you back to embryonic state. We found out that in long-term type 2 diabetes, your pancreatic islets lose the ability to produce insulin. At the beginning, you overproduce to compensate insulin resistance. And then you get exhausted and you go towards this so-called mesenchymal transition. So the cells that stain originally in green for insulin, they don't stain anymore for insulin, they stain red, for example. But we found out that if you use umbilical cord mesenchymal stromal cell from newborn baby at day 0, the youngest cells without going to embryonic, you can reverse this dedifferentiation of specialized tissue and bring them back to produce insulin like 30 years before, and they make us the cover of a big journal on this finding. But it proves that this can be reversible if you remove insulin resistance, and if you do, and we find out that this is mediated 80% by exosome extracellular vesicle through mitochondrial transfer, is a big message, because if you can do it for diabetes, maybe you can do it for neurodegeneration. Now we're working on Alzheimer to do intranasal spray exosome, where China is already in clinical trial, hopefully soon also here. But there is a huge opportunity to work on the whole ecosystem, the predictive marker, surrogate marker for early detection, then early intervention to block disease progression, and then this cellular therapy and a new strategy that could close the circle.
Yeah. And Alicia, as you're thinking about your investments, how does that align with where you see the science going? Because you're thinking about the frontier,
Yeah.
right? We're talking about this paradigm that can identifying these potential pathways, curing disease, then lead us further up front in the pipeline. You're thinking all the way through to the end. So how do you thinking about these investments really changing the paradigm of the discussion?
Yes, so I think it's helpful to also remember longevity is a very, very young field. Really, the activity didn't get started till the late 1990s. So the therapeutics that we have developed along the way are just going into clinical trials today. So we're very much still, in some ways, at the beginning, but accelerating with the work that's being done across the way. One of the things one of the pleasures of being at an ARPA is you can fund different approaches and attack the problem from different directions. So there's another line of thought here, and I think it's complementary, which is we've kind of been talking about these therapeutic approaches or other approaches more at a systemic level. But there's also an approach called replacement, which is many of our organs, for example, the brain or the heart, don't have the same regenerative capacity as, for example, our skin or our bones. And so if you suffer from traumatic brain injury, a stroke, or neurodegeneration, your brain cannot re-heal itself. And the brain is going to be the hardest thing to figure out how to heal. And so Jean Herbert, who's another one of our program managers who's here today, is making an extremely large investment, and there'll be an announcement on it soon, but a way to take your own stem cells and to grow them into actually a neocortical tissue graft. So functionally active with the right architecture that could be put into the damaged part of your brain and finish maturing there and rewire and reconnect. And it sounds like science fiction, and it's very, very difficult. But you can imagine that we could also think about doing this, and actually much easier in other parts of the body that are going to fail sooner than others, to be able to take your stem cells or other approaches to really replace those organs. But I think the brain is the real moonshot here, and we're really going to drive this field in that space.
How many in the room want to live until they're 100? 200 with two hands. All right. 90? 80? All right. Everyone mostly wants to live until 100.
But the real question
What?
that I ask is how many of you wants to live until 120, but feeling like when you were 30?
Exactly right. That was exactly where I was going, which is how do we live until we are 100 or 120 and have a biological age of 30? Mr. Rampini, what's the advice? How do we age to this level, but we can do so with a lot longer health?
I'm not going into their field because I would be ridiculous. So, but I think that optimism is good for your health, and we should try to practice optimism. And I was struck by one thing Alicia reminded us of, that longevity is a very recent field of study. You said in the 90s we started. I would link that fact with the fact that we were completely overwhelmed by a totally different kind of demographic psychosis. You know, last week, Paul Ehrlich died. He was an incredibly influential guru of demographics. He was the author of The Population Bomb, 1968. He was proved spectacularly wrong on everything he ever wrote and published. He never admitted being wrong, and he still has an enormous influence on the neo-Malthusian approach that we have to demography. That demography basically is the science of apocalypse and of doomsayers, of prophets of doom. So we were under the influence of a demographic science telling us that we were having too many children, or at least some parts of the world were having too many children. We would never be able to feed them. We would die of mass starvation. And so nobody was taking care of the real revolution, which was longevity. Because that was never talk about good things. Positive things are annoying. So I think the recipe is optimism is one of the many ingredients that might maybe not make you live longer, but if you live longer, at least you will be happier.
Yes, well, that's for sure. Professor Ricordi, so tell us, what's the advice? We have these risk-modifying behaviors that we all know, it's in literature, around what we can do today, right? So we know biomarkers are coming, they need to be validated. We know these $50 blood tests are coming, they need to be much more affordable for the general population, but there are some basic things that we can do today with our sleep, with our diet, with our exercise. As we had the hands raised with those who want to live to 120, what should they be doing today that will help them age longer and age well?
Yeah, it's very simple. So let's start standing up now, because I was at this Palasport TED conference with 3,000
We are
people.
literally standing up, okay.
No, but you're joking, but I was at the Palasport with 3,000 people from 100 countries, and I make all 3,000 stand up, because I said the first, rule number one, never sit more than 20 minutes. Okay. And so then we invented desk trays and a techno gym in Cesena. They only have balls and no chairs in any room. But you know, physical activity is one. Like nutrition, we said lifestyle. If you take a glucose sensor that now are cheaper and cheaper, luckily are more affordable, it's not just for diabetes to decide how much insulin to do when you don't produce any, but you will be surprised if you wear it for 2 weeks or 1 month and how much you learn about which food increase your blood glucose above 140, even if you have nothing to do with diabetes, just a spike of glucose and the glycemic variability that you have when you drink, for example, red wine from Italy, and then you take, your glucose is okay.
Only red wine from Italy.
Then you take an Aperol Spritz, boom, 180. You know, so you learn, for example, Campari, also from Italy, or Aperol, everything so sweet is, but you learn little things. Then if you want, you don't have to become a Taliban or nutrition and eat only celery, like, but at least you know, you're aware, like I want to have this ice cream and this Aperol Spritz, have it once every while. But I think then one thing that in this ecosystem we arrive to the purpose in life, the fact how to remain active with your brain. But another key thing is music and singing, not because of my family tradition, but I discover if you look at the Netflix, that encourage you to look, the Netflix series on all the blue zone from Okinawa, Sardinia, Costa Rica. Everybody of this ultra-centennial are either playing an instrument or singing, and maybe it's part of the ecosystem. But then there was one guy that instead says, what is your secret for longevity? And so I still play tennis, and I'm 98-year-old, and I play tennis. And there was it's a double message. And then they said, what is that trophy on the furniture. Is that a tennis a tournament? I said, no, that was the karaoke singing competition that I, so he was also doing that. But then tennis, for example, in sports, there is sport and sport. I'm a scientific director of Tennis and Friend in Rome, where you use a sport to take an opportunity to test 10,000, 20,000 people for free for these risk factors. In tennis, there is a big study showing that among all sport, tennis can increase longevity by 10 years, 9.7 years, followed by badminton, 8.6 years, and all ball sports. And then you have soccer, 5 years, swimming, 3 years, and gym alone is 1.5 years. So you can go to the gym all you want. It's very important anyway. Don't tell Neri Alessandri that I tell you it's techno gym. But this is why, because in tennis is social, is also eye-mind coordination, is equilibrium, so there is more than just physical extenuating sport that you need to do.
Okay. We have 5 minutes left, and I know we stand between you and the delicious red wine. So one question, I would love for anyone just to raise their hand, a comment or a question. Yes, right here. Yeah.
I think so. Try this. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So the question is, I've watched the Blue Zone. Well, both Italy and Japan had, shall we say, different outcome in the Second World War relative to the US, right? US came out successful, the Allies, Japan and Italy did not. Well, look at where we are now. Italy and Japan have the longest, lifespans on average, etc. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on healthcare or anything like that, but it almost suggests to me that they have a better baseline. They are able to just come back and continue living and rebuild, etc. But their health baseline was, it appears anyway, to have been better. Shouldn't our investment be targeted at the baseline? Exactly things like, societal engagement, community engagement, diet. Obviously, the food industry is now struggling to cope with the GLP-1 thing, and they're trying to modify their stuff. Is it only major stuff like GLP-1 that is going to change how food is produced in this country? So how do we fundamentally, through investment, change the baseline? Because Japan and Italy simply rebuilt and continued living longer.
And it's not genetic. It's not genetic is a small part, but there is a paper now that says maybe as much as 50%. But I have serious doubt, because if you take the Okinawa people and you move them to Seattle, their inflammation index increased like American to 16 instead of 1.5, and they have the same cardiovascular risk and problem of American for chronic disease. So there is a baseline, but there is also how we poison. And to go now to a supermarket is like being in a battlefield to try to find something that. And then I just found out, because I was helping the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition in agriculture, we're using these pesticides to dry wheat and flowers and things. They use a pesticide that if you spray on a weed, it dies instantly, and we use it to increase the rate of drying this product that then we all consume through whatever is produced. So it's such a challenge from, but I'm saying we're not going to change agriculture that fast or nutrition, but we can at least understand when we're going the wrong direction and try to mitigate and neutralize those risk factors.
Yeah, multi-factor. And we have one more question. Go ahead. Yeah, but Alicia, please.
I was just going to say very quickly, obviously Secretary Kennedy, who leads the Health and Human Services, I mean, this was what he campaigned on, the Make America Healthy Again movement. And so he's, there's investment, but much of it is regulatory and incentive driven in the United States, and there's a major focus on that.
Absolutely. All right, there's a question in the back. Please stand up and. Can we get a mic? Yeah, mic. Thank you.
The last point was May, and I know that the longevity field is still new. There have been some studies on senolytics, for example, that haven't been successful. And right now, I work in the lab before, and now I'm the FDA. And I see, as in science happens sometimes at friends in interest in the food. The fat mice, the lean mice, how food can have an impact on diseases. But it seems that attention on, my question for you is, if there is an attention on environmental pollutants in the research. For example, we know that pollutants or microplastic has a huge impact on inflammation that may have an impact on longevity. So I wonder if the research is moving towards that interest as well.
It very much is, and I would say stay tuned for 1 week from now.
You don't want to break news this evening. Do you want to respond to that? Yes.
No, that is incredible. We're doing now a review paper on the toxic element in the food chain, like starting is a very complicated, and some people says don't publish it because you'll be sued by a lot of Monsanto and other industries. So we're pondering on this and presenting in the challenge of providing enough food to feed 8 billion people and the challenge of do it in a healthy way. But I would like to end on a positive note, because we say who can afford to live longer, but is who can afford to live longer sick as economy. And I'm going to speak next month at the Economic Forum in Trent to organize a big meeting, because the actual impact of adding years of healthy lifespan can generate, someone said, $38 trillion for every year added to the global economy savings. So maybe it's over-optimistic, but there are huge savings. Think from a GDP of a country, if you move from a reactive medicine to a proactive, predictive, preventive, and you can increase 4 points your GDP, improve it. You could do so much more with what you save. So it's really something that gives me hope that we can really have an impact.
We've learned so much this evening. Thank you to each of you. As we close the evening and close this discussion, what's the one takeaway that you want everyone to walk away from all the things that you've shared, from your experiences in this space? We have scientists in the room. We have those that are researchers. We have those from academia. We have those that are from media and everything in between, and policymakers. What is the one request or call to action that you would have for our audience here?
Let's not approach longevity mostly as an economic cost, but more as a reservoir of resources and wealth. And let's have a holistic approach where a good life is made of several ingredients, and the experts have very, very important information about those, but also a sense of purpose is very important.
Well, I think one very important message is that it's an ecosystem and there is no single magic bullet or remedy. And my fear is that we fund trials or things that are monotherapy, like let's look at rapamycin, let's look at omega-3, let's look at vitamin D, without everything, the 99% that is around, that if you don't affect or control at least, in all the intervention trial for diabetes, now I'm saying at our institute, did you check the baseline inflammation and vitamin D between responder and non-responder? So there's such important little detail that if we learn something in a trial net in NIH for autoimmune diseases or islet transplantation, cell therapy, now we're doing tons of stem cell-derived cell transplant, IPS, inducible pluripotent stem cell. We work with Japan, with China, with anyone. But it's like you have to be so careful, not forgetting what is around, and that combination therapy are generally the success. And TrialNet went 30 years studying one molecule at a time because the study session says, it's too complicated. If you have 3, how do you know which one is which? And then the trial has to be too big. But if you study only one at a time, maybe it's a very critically important component, that molecule, of a combination strategy that is eventually successful to prolong your healthy lifespan. So I hope you can keep that in mind as we evolve in this very young field.
I think one of the most exciting things about this whole path towards increasing longevity, increasing healthy years, is not just the end goal, but all the research that's towards that, because it's not focused on solving a single disease, because it has a much broader view, looks at the system, so many benefits will fall out of that that actually have huge disease impact, huge impact on human lives. And so as the research progresses, everyone will feel benefits along the way by what comes out of that research. And you have to remember, only 1%, I think, of all R&D in the US has any sort of longevity focus today. It's tiny. But I think it's one of the biggest things we can focus on as a nation because of all the benefits that will come from it.
I am incredibly struck by the optimism and the opportunity for us to transform human health by investing in longevity, because it has implications not only here in the US, it certainly has implications around the world. Thank you so much to the Ambassador for hosting such an incredible evening. Thank you to our panelists. And off to dinner.
Thank you very much to our speakers, to our fantastic moderators. My three key takeaways are very simple. First, next time, no chairs. Secondly, next time, no spritz, but only red wine. Third, with a touch of optimism, in spite of the lack of chairs and the spritz, I hope you come back for the next Villa Firenze Talks, and thank you very much for being here with us.